Should we be putting this on recording?
Well, let's start. This is the fifth in our series, the Wolf-Krugman Exchange. I'm Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator of the Financial Times.
And I'm Paul Krugman, professor at the City University of New York and author of an independent Substack newsletter. And today's episode is being recorded on Monday, June 30th at 9 in the morning in Massachusetts, where I am now, and 2 p.m. in London.
So, tell us where you've been recently, Paul.
Yeah. Occasionally I do stupid things. So I was in Sao Paulo last week, and I spent 0 nights there. I took the overnight flight down, spoke at a big financial conference, and then took the overnight flight back. So I spent 2 successive nights sleeping on airplanes, which is really stupid, although somehow or other I managed not to get sick.
Well, that makes me feel much better about my trip. Last Monday night, I went to Delhi, but I actually spent 4 days there, and I was attending a conference on economic policy of the National Council for Applied Economic Research, and I met a number of policymakers and journalists and got a really sort of interesting little new take and met some friends who are very involved in, engaged in, thinking about what's happening in India, which is a very interesting country right now. And amazing to me, having worked on India when it was hardly growing at all 50 years ago, it's now the fastest growing large economy in the world and sort of looks likely to continue to be.
Yeah, several Brazilians gave me the old joke about Brazil is the country of the future and always will be. So a little bit disappointing there.
It is disappointing. And back in the 60s, Brazil was a 10% of GDP growth a year. And we all thought it was there forever, which always reminds me that success is not guaranteed, but neither happily is failure. Things can come back. And that, in a way, brings us very well to where we are now. We've been talking about all sorts of things that are going wrong, particularly in the US, and because of what's happening in the US, the whole world is being changed. But I want to talk a bit about how much of the guardrails, the sort of things that we took for granted, the norms and rules and all the rest of it, that worked in the global economy, in trade and finance and all the rest of it, are now being tested to destruction. Anyway, we're going to look into the future, what might be left at the end of the present upheaval. So let's start with this. We've often heard the phrase, this time it's different, and usually it isn't. But somehow we both think, or at least I know I do, and I suspect you do, that maybe this time really is different. So do you think, when we look back at this period, a few years from now, when you think about what's going on, that the world, and the US above all in it, will look just fundamentally different?
Yes, I do. And we record this, and things may have happened by the time it's released, but I think the timing is relevant here. As we speak, the US Senate is voting on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which is the Trump's plan for a combination of large tax cuts at the top, savage cuts in social welfare programs, and a bunch of other stuff. And don't really want to talk about the contents of the bill at this point, but I think it's worth saying something about the name, because the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is the actual name of the bill. And where'd that come from? Well, Trump has this odd verbal tick of calling things beautiful, which is not the way normal Americans speak. It might be with the way mobsters speak, though I'm not sure about it. But anyway, this is not normal English. But he did express his desire to have all of his agenda rolled into one big, beautiful bill. And Congress, both the House and the Senate, have named the legislation the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which sounds pretty ridiculous. It's kind of just flattering the leader, and that's not the way legislators, not the way people in general talk in republics. It's not what you expect to see. It's no, the U.S. senators are traditionally, they're often empty stuffed shirts, pompous, but a kind of dignity was the appearance of dignity was part of the role. And now, just because the leader used some really strange language, they've picked it up, and that's the name of the legislation, which I think is a lot more telling than people realize. It's not a side detail. It's saying that there's a level of slavish devotion to the leader principle, that this is Washington turning into Pyongyang on the Potomac. And this is not the political system or psychology that we used to have. And it's hard to avoid the sense that America, at least, is just politically, at least, not at all the same country it was a few years ago, not all the same country we thought it was. And of course, that then ramifies through the whole international system.
I think that's absolutely right. And I can remember it quite precisely when I not only thought that, but wrote it. And it was when Trump announced in, I think, late November or early December 2020, that actually he'd won the election. And there was no question that he'd won the election. And then, of course, he and others around him fomented this insurrection on January the 6th in Congress. It was clearly designed to overthrow the outcome of the election. It didn't succeed, but what really struck me most is then and afterwards, he imprinted upon his party. It became essentially a necessary condition to survive as a senior level in the party, in Congress and elsewhere, to buy into this lie, the big lie, that he'd won the election. And that remains the case. So I then used in a column I think I wrote at the end of January that this is the clearest example I'd seen in my own life of the Führerprinzip, the principle that the leader defines the reality, which of course was a central belief of the Nazis. And the similarity, as you pointed out, is astonishing, and it has been amazingly consistent. And the implications are, of course, absolutely devastating for the survival of democracy.
Yeah, and I would add that there's a kind of a Gresham's law, certainly on the Republican side in U.S. politics. Gresham's law says that bad money drives out good. If you have a mixture of counterfeit, dubious, debased coins and genuine ones in circulation, well, people hang on to the good coins, and all that's left in circulation are the bad coins. You are, sincere conservative Republican, but can't stand this kind of fundamentally unrepublican stuff, you leave. The people who are still there are the people who are willing to put up with this. And so, there have been a lot of jokes that next thing Trump is going to try to make his horse consul, which is probably a slander against Caligula, by the way. But that's the kind of atmosphere we're in.
I actually agree with you that this is the fundamental change, and it's the change I wrote about back in a column which I said Donald Trump is how great republics meet their end, because ultimately the core of Republican politics is that everybody engaged is in some sense his or her own master or mistress. They feel they're accountable to themselves. They are not slaves of some leader who tells them what to do and what to think. And if necessary, you vote against your party. You vote against because that's what you're there for. Even our members of parliament, who are famously slavish, have done that on many occasions. But what we're seeing now with this really quite obscene bill, which you referred to, quite an astonishing bill in its the savagery of its regressive economics and politics, and the extent to which it betrays the people who voted for him so blatantly. This is the outcome of that sort of politics. The politics in which you follow the leader. And in the way, everything else we're seeing, the attacks on institutions, the attacks on the law, the attacks on international treaties, all that emanates from the fact that the leader's word, his will, his word is the law.
Yeah, I mean, and it's crazy to be saying that, now here in the 21st century. But so we're very U.S. centric here, but I don't think the United States is alone, though. I think we're miles ahead of the rest of the Western world in these changes. But this stuff, which is primarily, mostly domestic policy for the U.S., but you require a U.S. that is committed to norms, laws, agreements, where a solemn agreement to do something actually matters. And if we have a country where, depending on what the leader is feeling that morning, it's very hard to run an international system if that happens to be also the one of the world's most important economies and powers.
Of course, we know very well, we've really known since the early 1920s that domestic US politics is also international politics. In fact, I've always felt on the principle of no taxation without representation, as it were, everybody should have a vote in US elections. So what we were talking about, the changes in the core of American politics, are also changes for the world. And on your question, which I think is a very important one, how general this is, well, this style of politics in which there is a leader who is seen as somehow above the law, above the institutions, who speaks for the people. Well, I've just been in a country where the prime minister is seen in exactly the same way, an even bigger democracy, India, where it is accepted that, at least by his side, which is a huge proportion of the population, and they've held power now for 11 years and are likely to continue to do so, certainly for the rest of this term, perhaps beyond that. And they also have exactly the same view of the great leader. So now, it's not yet clear to me that in Britain that a few years from now, Nigel Farage will emerge as our great leader. That remains very much open to question, though people are sort of beginning to think about this. But certainly America has moved in directions which only 10 years ago I would have thought unthinkable. The question, I suppose, to think about here is, how confident do you feel in either direction about its stability, this system? Can it continue to hold America in the way it is? I mean, for example, when I argued exactly this in India, I did a lecture on exactly this in India, the pushback was, well, they're going to be the midterms. The Americans are never going to put up with this. It's really a bit of a mess, and everything will go back to normal. How comfortable do you feel in either direction about the future of the US in this context?
I'm not comfortable in either direction. I'm neither a total pessimist nor a comfortable optimist. For what it's worth, the American public hates what's going on. Public opinion on this legislation is incredibly negative, and that's with most people still not having a full sense of what's in it. We do have in the American system, we have special elections, which are, a seat becomes vacant for whatever reason, and at both state and federal level offices, and there's a special election held, and in the special elections so far, Democrats have been outperforming 2024 by about 15 percentage points. So if it's up for a vote and the vote counts, then there's would appear to be a strong chance that we reverse this. Now, the trouble is, first of all, do people remember, even if the elections are held normally, will people remember a year and a half and 3.5 years from now what it was that they hated, or will this have all become kind of normalized? And also, we have a lot of fears about the actual functioning of democracy. I mean, again, I'm sorry, this is a U.S.-centric discussion, but I think that's unavoidable given where the action is right now. One of the things this bill does is it gives a roughly 1,000% increase in the budget of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is, and these are the people, masked federal agents without any identification, snatching people and jailing them and deporting them on the streets of America. This is hard to believe, but it's been happening. So we're creating what can easily be described as a massive secret police force in America. So are we actually going to have fair elections next year, let alone in 2028? Probably yes, because we do have a federal system in which a lot of this stuff is not under control from Washington, but nobody is sure. And so, on the other hand, as I said, the public opinion has been very thermostatic here. The public has turned hard against what the Trump administration is trying to do. He's not building support. He's bleeding support very rapidly among voters. And then there's also the possibility, which I hope we'll get into, which is that maybe the U.S. is not quite as essential to the international system as it used to be.
So let's talk about that a bit more. If you think about the implications, we talk about the trade system, the monetary system, future of the dollar, America as an ally, America's role now in trying to make it impossible to do anything about climate, America's brutal castration of USAID with potentially vast numbers of victims, and more broadly, the future of development finance. These are a huge set of issues. What do you think the rest of the world should be doing to avoid collapses in all these areas? I'll just give you an indication of what I was arguing in India. I just focused on the trade in the lecture, and I was arguing this with some senior officials, but I was saying, okay, to take one example of what they could do, let's suppose India reaches a deal with the US on trade. It will be in keeping with the principles of the trading system, and in my view, very much in the interests of India and the world, if it said, whatever concessions we grant to the United States in this deal, we will extend to all our other trading partners on the most favored nation principle. Non-discrimination. You will see that we abide by the rules. And in my view, all countries that reach a deal like this with the US should do this. But India will be a very big gesture because it's a significant country. So that sort of thing that I've been thinking about, what countries should be doing to show this isn't the new normal. Similarly, in climate, we can continue to operate in accordance with our agreements. And I think the EU should proceed with its border adjustment mechanism, just saying, well, if you're not going to do anything about this, you're going to pollute the world's environment in this way, we are going to impose a countervailing duty upon your exports to take account of that. And that should be the shared position of everybody else. So there are things people can do if they're brave enough. What do you think about it?
Yeah, this whole post-war order that my country's government seems determined to tear down was built at a time when, roughly speaking, America was half the world economy.
Indeed.
We're now something like a quarter of the world economy, and less than that, considerably less than that of world trade. And so there are three economic superpowers, and depending on your measurement, you can rank them different, but they're all really, really big, which is the China, the United States, and the EU, and especially if on some of these issues, despite Brexit, Britain operates with the EU. EU plus Britain is a pretty hefty power and very big in world trade. Very big in terms of things like greenhouse gas emissions, and so it's entirely possible. At least it's physically, financially possible for us to have a kind of a world order minus one, a G19 instead of a G20, where we throw out the U.S. because the U.S. has lost its mind, and continue, as you say. The most concrete thing would be to um, most favored nation principle in trade. That's probably not the most inspiring thing to most people, but it's kind of a nice test case. And in the case of India, India is one of the few countries that actually can make significant trade concessions because it actually still has significant tariffs. Nothing like what it used to have, but some. European Union basically can't slash its tariffs because they're already de minimis, but it can say, look, we're not going to emulate the United States. We're going to continue so far as we can to abide by the traditional rules of international trade, and we're going to reach out to the rest of the world, to India. China is always a little problematic, but try to, manage relations with China, reach out to Australia and Canada and Japan. And so the rest of the world could continue. We can have an international order that does not center on the United States. Then that would be a relatively happy outcome for the world.
I've actually also been arguing with to the Chinese that if you look at their industrial policy, we can debate how successful it's been, but there are real, pretty obvious problems even from their point of view in a world in which nobody wants to invest in China, which is where we're moving to, because they feel that all their intellectual property is going to be siphoned away from them. It's really not at all obvious that there are huge industrial subsidies outside a few very narrow areas are really working. And China has an opportunity here, an extraordinary opportunity to become a truly respected power that the rest of the world feels relatively more trust in than they do in the US, which is unthinkable, really. Maybe with the present Chinese political system, that's actually impossible as the way it's set up. But if the US is abdicating, others can play a leading role in these sorts of areas. Europe certainly should, but maybe the Chinese will see the opportunity here.
Yeah. Yeah, China has the problem, which is that it's kind of difficult for authoritarian regimes to make credible promises.
Indeed.
This is, and which we would always say is this is a real problem for China. Now it's a real problem for the United States, but they can at least move in that direction. And then there is, of course, certainly some serious opportunity on multiple fronts for Europe and to some extent other democratic rule of law countries. It's a trickle so far, but I do know academics who are decamping for Canada. The environment in the United States is too politicized, and China is trying to recruit some. So yes. I mean, academia is a pretty unrepresentative thing, though, in the modern world. Certainly science and technology matter more. And if China starts to see itself as actually a haven from chaos rather than a rising great power that needs to throw its weight around, they could help. I mean, I still think that the center of gravity of global sanity is now in Europe, but China can at least help.
Well, one of the factors here, which I have been talking to people about, is obviously America has a very large number of Chinese and Indian scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, people who run major American businesses, think Microsoft, think Google. If you start feeling that you and your children are vulnerable to the sorts of threats you just talked about, which they obviously are, can't be even sure they'll get into the country, some of them, then people might start thinking, well, maybe we should go back home. It wouldn't be really very surprising, at least cumulatively, if that starts to happen.
Yeah. One thing that sort of as the economist, one of the odd things you discover on an important part of the U.S. right is that we talk about the lump of labor fallacy, the idea that there's a certain number of jobs.
Yep.
And if you If you give them to one person, then you take it away from another. And one of the things you find on people on the U.S. right, people like Steve Bannon and so on, that they have a lump of labor theory, not just of jobs in general, but even of high technology jobs. They say, oh, there are these high-paying, prestigious positions in Silicon Valley. Why are we letting people from South Asia and East Asia take those positions? Those should be going to Americans. So they actually think that you can throw out the engineers at Apple and Google and replace them with native-born Americans, and that there is no loss in so doing. And this, of course, well, this is a good way to move the center of technological development away from the United States.
That actually fits beautifully with a question I was going to discuss with you. After all of the excitement of Liberation Day and all the rest of it, there was quite a bit of turmoil in the stock market, but it sort of recovered. And the markets seem to be pretty comfortable with what's going on. They don't seem to see the possible futures we are seeing at all, or maybe they're even enjoying it. They're just looking at the one big beautiful bill and the wonderful tax cuts. Are they being myopic, or are they being realistic that the one group of people that is going to come out of this really well are the existing corporate behemoths and the profits that they can be expected to have in what is actually a regime extremely favorable to the corporate oligopoly, as it were, if that's the best term. Yeah. And so the markets are actually telling the truth about what interests them, but it doesn't happen to be the longer-term future of the US.
Well, one point to make right away is that there are different markets. And if you look at the bond market and the foreign exchange market, they're telling a quite different story.
Correct.
The United States has, since the beginning of this year, has seen interest rates rise, not a whole amount, because there's tension between budget deficit concerns and, on the other hand, recession possibilities that might lead to Fed rate cuts. But we've also seen a combination of rising interest rates and a falling dollar. Dollar is about 10% since the start of the year, which is something that never happens in the United States. The U.S. is always higher interest rates bring money in, the dollar goes up. The combination of rising interest rates and a falling currency is something that you see in emerging markets, something that, didn't get to have a lot of conversations in Brazil, but that's, the Brazilians are saying, you kind of look like us now, where people are fleeing your bond market and also fleeing your currency. And so the stock market stands out and being either extremely complacent, or it's also actually true, by the way, if you measure the value of U.S. stocks in euros, it looks kind of different. I mean, we always say that the stock market is not the economy. And if we're going to have a regime in which the U.S. economy grows more slowly and there's all kinds of disruption, but corporate profits are even more exempt from taxes than they are now, you could see a combination of stocks rising and fairly dire economic outlook. But I would also say I think people really are still not thinking about what all of this is going to mean for the U.S. economy, and we're talking all about tariffs and Liberation Day, but what's really happening now? We're still in suspense about what's going to happen with the tariffs, but they remain extremely high and are probably going to stay there. But we're also now talking about deportation is rapidly accelerating. So we're now seeing large parts of the U.S. labor force either getting rounded up or basically going into hiding for fear of being rounded up. Which is, a negative labor supply shock that hits particular industries, that hits agriculture and construction. That's also another reason to be worried. And it doesn't look to me as if the stock market is discounting that at all.
I mean, similarly, they don't seem to be paying much attention to the longer run implications of the attack on research funding and the major universities, which is the seed corn for future American innovation, as it has been for the last, at least since the Second World War.
That's right. And and it's crazy stuff. I mean, sorry, we want to be calm and analytical and not too political, but turns out that large numbers of um, grants are being canceled because they include the word trans, and sometimes it could be things like transgenic or transnational or somebody just did a kind of control F search of grant applications, and if the letter combination trans appears, the grant is canceled without any regard for context. This is not how you run a 21st century economy.
Do you think, in our discussion we had about the politics, and it's interesting your comments on people's reaction to the One Big Beautiful Bill, how far do you think people are aware of what's going on and understand the economic implication? Is a big part of what's going on, because I've thought very much this is part of what these populist movements are relying on. Essentially, they're able to fool people. Not necessarily all of the people all of the time, but some of the people all of the time, and that's enough. You talk about, in your writing, about low information voters. There are quite a lot of them, and the changes in the media that we've seen, it seems to me, in the last 20, 30 years have clearly exacerbated that. So is it actually possible for what's going on to get through to people who don't really want to pay any attention to politics?
Well, that's, of course, a really big question. The thing I guess I would say here is that, and first of all, even now, the polling suggests that people have a very negative view of what's happening now, and which is kind of amazing because who knows what's actually in legislation, right? And there's a lot of deliberate obfuscation involved in this legislation as well. There's fancy footwork to hide the impact on the deficit. There's we're going to throw millions of people off Medicaid, but not by actually denying them Medicaid, but by imposing impossible paperwork requirements and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of deliberate concealment, and yet the polling is very negative. But the main thing, I think, is if this stuff all happens, it's going to affect a lot of people directly. Just take a very American thing that's going to happen. We have huge cuts to Medicaid, which is our health program for lower income families, and which has 80 million people are on it. It's not just that a lot of people will lose coverage, but that a lot of hospitals will close, especially in rural areas. People are rather heavily dependent, and these hospitals need, the paying patients are largely paying because they're getting federal money. I think a lot of people will be absolutely enraged when they see that their local hospital has closed and they have to drive an hour and a half to get medical care. Will they connect that to the policies? And that, I think, is the big unknown. This is not one of these things where this is all going to be abstract and not affecting people's lives. People's lives are going to be massively affected, but will they find ways to blame someone else? Is it that I don't know, somehow or other immigrants are responsible for the fact that your local hospital closed?
One of the questions I have is, we were thinking about reactions of people, reactions of markets. But one of the possible things that can happen when things go badly wrong is essentially you have financial crises. Now, these are very unpredictable, but you think of three things that are going on right now. You have an American commitment to what looks like a pretty irresponsible fiscal policy by most standards. I think even if you're quite Keynesian, this is a full employment economy. Do you want 7% of GDP? How fiscal deficits forever? You have a lot of pressure on the Fed of various kinds. And who knows who the next Fed chair will be. Then you clearly have an almost pathological desire, particularly given the experience we had with the global financial crisis not that long ago, to deregulate finance in every possible direction. Stable
Yeah.
coins, Bitcoin, the whole works, bank capital ratios, and so forth. For somebody like me, perhaps overly conservative European, this looks like a precursor to another financial crisis. We never know when it's going to happen, but it looks sort of a really gung-ho mess. Now, I'm not suggesting myself, of course, any timetable for this, but this looks a pretty serious risk down the pike if something doesn't stop this, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. And of course, always Dornbusch's law, my old teacher,
Yes,
Rudy Dornbusch,
I've
said that
cited that
if a
very
crisis
recently.
takes longer to happen than you can possibly imagine, and then when it comes, it happens faster than you can possibly imagine. And I think we may very well be in a Dornbusch's law situation here. And sure, if you look at all of these financial innovations, all of them, and this is where the "this time is different" sarcastic remark comes in. They look amazingly like just teched up versions of regulatory errors made in the past. And so, are we setting ourselves up for financial crisis? It sure looks like it. And I do worry, by the way, it kind of intersects with the question of the Fed. The Federal Reserve sets short-term interest rates, effectively, if you like, controls the money supply. And Trump has constantly pushed for the Fed to basically print money, to goose up the economy, to rev it up. And if he gets a Fed chair who is amenable to whatever he wants, then this could look a lot like situations we've seen typically in emerging markets, where the attempt to goose up the economy for political gain eventually leads to runaway inflation. We don't know who the next Fed chair will be, but it's a pretty good bet that you'll get somebody who is a slavish adherent to the leader principle, or at least someone who pretends to be. If I were Trump, I would be deeply worried that he appoints somebody who suddenly discovers that he's his own man once he's in that seat. But then you start to talk about places like Turkey, where monetary policy became highly politicized, and the leader decided that the way to fight inflation was to cut interest rates. And Turkey managed to get itself up to around 80% inflation before Erdogan finally said, maybe these orthodox monetary economists know something after all. So wild stuff is definitely possible. I would not put I don't know if there's a betting market where you can bet against U.S. financial stability over the next 5 to 10 years, but I would certainly bet against it.
Well, you could bet on the interest rates at the end of it.
Yeah.
They might end up at a pretty ferocious level. I'm a bit concerned that the conditions for a crisis will be created. There might be the election of a Democrat because of all the reasons we've said, but it's still very much a 50-50 country because it looks like being that whatever. And then you have the monstrous crisis in, let's say, 2030 or 2031, and the incumbent will be blamed. It could be a poison pill that will be bequeathed by this administration, which in this area just looks just wildly irresponsible.
Yeah, and one of the sad things about what the political scientists tell me is that basically, to the extent that people look at things at all, they look backwards, not at the actual policies, and they blame whoever is in power for bad stuff. And U.S. and British politics took quite different directions after 2008 for no obvious reason except for the fact that you happen to have a Republican president and a Labor prime minister. So that's all kinds of crazy stuff can happen. All kinds of things that used to be just outside the realm of the plausible are now fully within the realm of the entirely plausible.
Well, the big point there is democracy is imperfect. We've known that. and one does depend quite significantly on a political elite, a political class, also bureaucrats, others, who are fundamentally responsible, who know there's a limit beyond which they should not go, both in the way they politic, the way they get support, the way they attack opponents. There has to be some sense of a shared responsibility to the system, and people have to have a sense that they share not just a belief in and adherence to the political and constitutional order, but they actually, in some sense, respect their opponents because they're part of one system. If that's gone, if basically politics is just civil war by another means, then it's really difficult to get back into something stable. And this is what worries me very much about what's happening to the politics in many countries, but first and foremost to the US, that people don't seem to feel that, as it were, the opposition is the loyal opposition and that the government is a legitimate government. How do you get back from that?
That's a really good question, and to which it's hard to find answers. I mean, we always we would criticize and make fun of the establishment and the elites, and I think this is really more of a problem of the elites than the general public.
Yes,
the
it's the
public
problem
has
of the
never been as
elites.
committed, and how it was a club. People actually used to call the Senate, the U.S. Senate, the world's most exclusive club, and it was stodgy, and a lot of it was sustained by bad stuff. I mean, the age of a really strong bipartisanship in the United States was largely sustained by the existence of a block of racist Democrats from the South. So it was not a happy story in many ways, but there was a sense that we are part of a system, that this guy across the aisle from me, I will be dealing with that guy for the next 15 years of my life, that there are certain kind of rules, norms to be accepted. That's all shattered now. And who upholds? We have institutions, but institutions are actually just people. Institutions, what makes an institution is that people have decided that it is in their interest to uphold some institutional rules and norms. Once that's shattered, how do you rebuild? And I don't know the answer to that. And unfortunately, this is not something even if all the good stuff happens, even if decent people win the next few elections in the United States, it's going to take more than a few elections to reestablish a system that is reliably democratic again.
Clearly right. And the point you make about people mattering, because ultimately institutions are run by people and they don't operate on their own, and they have to be filled with a sense of constitutional propriety. It sounds so pompous, but yet there must be a sense there are limits beyond which you don't go. And unfortunately, there are a lot of limits beyond which Mr. Trump has quite clearly gone. So the conclusion here is that this really is a pretty big mess, but the rest of the world can do things and should do things and must do things. And I suppose we have to keep on hoping that the United States, which is so important, will find its way back to some sense of how the Constitution should operate.
But let me say, if I want to say something optimistic, I think there's a lot more goodwill and democratic sentiment in the general public. I actually did join the No King's Day March in New York, and Trump was trying to have his Red Square style military parade in D.C., which was a complete flop, and there were millions, probably 5 to 6 million people demonstrating against him on the same day around the U.S. And there's a lot of people. Maybe there's enough popular support. It's the hope, anyway.
I hope so. So I think we've looked very closely at where we are and where we might go, and left with hope. And so it's a time for the cultural coda. So what's yours, Paul?
Okay, so I actually took a song, one of the lesser known Stephen Sondheim musicals, but Merrily We Roll Along, which is, it's largely about the corruption of money and power. It's about creative artists who succumb and become their worst selves. But there's a song which actually in various versions recurs through it, Going, Going, Gone. And so, we had a good thing going, and we let it slide, and it's going, going, gone. And the lyrics, it's a beautiful song, and the lyrics seem remarkably apropos to where we are in my country right now.
So, just to convince everybody that I'm not merely an eccentric, but a cultural snob, the music that means most to me, in honest truth, is opera. And I was thinking about a song about where we are. And the opera that comes closest to this is Beethoven's one opera, the Fidelio, which is about unjustly imprisoned people who have been seized from as it were, from the street innocently and put in prison and threatened with death there. And the hero is complicated, but the man, most significant figure who's imprisoned unjustly, is called Florestan. And this song, which is sung by Jonas Kaufmann, the great German singer, and the song is called Freiheit, which is just freedom. And it's a wonderful paean to the importance, the meaning, the significance of freedom. And in this opera, it's not just freedom from imprisonment, but freedom from injustice. It is Beethoven's statement of the immense importance of freedom, and it seems somehow incredibly appropriate today.
All seems right, and let's hope for the best.
Indeed. On that final note, thank you very much for listening to Part 5 of the Wolf-Krugman Exchange. We'll be back with you again next week when we'll spend the whole episode answering questions you've sent to Paul and me over the course of the series. If you'd like to get in touch, there's still time. The email address is in the show notes. Thanks very much for listening, and we look forward to our discussion next time.